When police received a call on December 22nd, 1939 at 3 a.m., they could never have imagined where this case would take them. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. At around 3 a.m. in Mishawaka, Indiana, William Joyce was driving down a highway when, without warning, a man stumbled into the snow-covered highway in front of William Joyce. Unable to avoid this person that suddenly appeared on the highway in front of their car in the snowy weather, William Joyce hit this person. Of course, William stops his car, he jumps out, he runs to this man who he hit, and he begins to try to render first aid to this person. But he would soon realize that these injuries were very, very bad and they could be deadly. So of course, William runs to his car, he jumps back in his car, and he begins to drive to find somebody to call the police. Eventually, he was able to find a phone, and he called the police, and around 3:30 a.m., police arrived on scene. And when police arrived, they noticed that obviously this man was hit by a car. There's multiple injuries that looked like he had been hit. And it wasn't a hit and run. Obviously, the person that hit him ran and got help. And of course, this does look like an accident that was consistent with being hit by a car. The victim had multiple broken bones, including his neck. He had internal bleeding, severe trauma to his chest, legs, and torso. So police are looking at this and they're like, yeah, this is a pretty terrible accident. It wasn't a hit and run. The man stopped his car. He tried to render aid. He ran. He got help. But what they noticed about the victim would soon leave them swirling with questions. This man was later identified as 44-year-old Stephen Melkey. Stephen was a factory worker who had 3 children, and unfortunately, he was a widower. Stephen did not regain consciousness and would actually die en route to the hospital. But police would realize that this was no accident, and the crime scene was riddled with really complex clues. When they found Stephen, they noted that his hands were bound behind his back. He was missing a shoe, and his eyes and mouth had actually been wrapped with many layers of 2-inch thick medical tape. So he had tape around his mouth, like all the way around his head multiple times, and his eyes. And when the tape was actually removed from his mouth, they would pull out a handkerchief with lipstick on it. And that was actually lodged in his throat. Obviously, I mentioned that it was snowing, so police followed Stephen's footprints in the snow. Police were able to determine that Stephen had been dropped off by a vehicle approximately 140 feet from where he was actually hit by the car. They noted that the car had backed up before driving away. Stephen had also been bound by the ankles, but he was able to break that so that he could walk. But he wasn't able to get his hands free so that he could obviously remove the tape around his mouth and his eyes. And then Stephen would just kind of wander aimlessly. Remember, he cannot see anything, he can't yell for help, but he's obviously trying to get to help. He would actually walk through a small wooded area before turning and walking through a culvert, and that's actually where he lost his shoe in the snow. The police were actually able to recover it. They believe that at this time he actually sat down, maybe he was trying to gather his thoughts, collect himself so that he could continue walking. Stephen obviously just needed a break. He was in extreme stress at this point. And then he would get up and he'd continue walking towards the highway. But police would soon realize something incredibly haunting. There was a second set of footprints following Stephen's. They were actually parallel to his footprints, meaning as Stephen's walking, somebody is walking side by side with him. It's not known whether or not this person was actively talking to Stephen and Stephen knew if they were there, or if they were simply following him. And although police officers couldn't conclusively link these footprints to Stephen's case, they theorized that the killer had pretty much walked beside him and watched him and maybe even at one point lured him onto the highway. Or some people believe that he was actually forced onto the highway and pushed in front of that moving car. So police immediately went back to Stephen's house and they began questioning his sons. He had 3 sons, Robert, who was 18, Leonard, who was 14, and Frederick, who was 8. And they were all asleep when the police arrived. They said that they last seen their father at around 11 p.m. and Stephen had actually been home and studying because he wanted to become a foreman at the factory that he worked at. And of course, police are looking around the home and they realized that there was no forced entry, nothing was out of place, it didn't look like a struggle had occurred, so they assumed that Stephen was pretty much lured out of his house, and it was most likely by somebody he knew. And then they theorized that whoever lured him out of his house probably abducted him. Police would actually immediately start bringing in people for questioning, and they brought in a 27-year-old local waitress and her fiance. Bertie DeVos actually worked at a tavern that Stephen frequented quite often, and he had actually struck up a relationship with this woman. They were apparently very friendly with each other. But her soon-to-be husband, Alan Pomsky, didn't like this, and he certainly didn't take kindly to the relationship. And apparently due to this friendship or relationship or whatever they were having, it actually led DeVos's fiance, Alan, to get into verbal altercations with Stephen on more than one occasion. So of course the pair were questioned extensively, and they both denied having anything to do with the crime. They claimed that they were at the tavern for most of the evening, and Alan would eventually drop his fiance off at around 3:30 a.m. at her home, and then he went home. They were actually eventually brought in a second time for a lie detector test, and they both apparently passed. Police would also look at the couple's cars to look for the prints that had been left at the scene, and neither of their cars actually matched the prints at the scene. So again, they were released. They had no evidence that these two had committed any sort of crime. They would also bring in a 41-year-old coworker named George Smith, and he had actually worked with Stephen, and he was actually very fond of this waitress. And apparently him and Stephen had actually gotten into quite a few arguments at this tavern that she worked at, apparently about her. But his vehicle tires didn't match the vehicle tires at the crime scene, and he passed a lie detector test. They really didn't have any other suspects. Police, of course, kept the investigation open and continued to interview people, but they never found who had committed this crime. So at that time, apparently his sons were sent to an orphanage where they were later adopted. 2 of the older boys joined the military. 1 unfortunately died during that time. Leonard actually died while serving, and he was only 17. Robert would actually pass away in 2004, and Frederick would actually pass away in 2011. And they never knew what happened to their father. So this case is just utterly bizarre because nobody knows what happened to Stephen. This was actually a really intense crime when you kind of break it down. This man was abducted sometime after 11 p.m. when his sons went to bed. We don't really know, obviously, what happened, if he was beaten or anything like that, because remember, he was hit by a car, so had he been beaten and bruised and everything, I'm not sure you would be able to distinguish that. I mean, the car hit him so hard and flung his body so far that obviously he would be bruised everywhere. So we don't actually know what happened between 11 and 3 when he was hit by this car. But the fact that he had tape around his eyes and his mouth and his hands and legs were bound, somebody had some pretty bad intentions. I do feel like it was closer to home because this person was abducted. Something had made Stephen leave home that night. And really, what would make him leave home other than being lured out by somebody he knew? Or perhaps maybe he went out and he was heading to the local tavern and somebody saw him and picked him up knowing that they wanted to kill him. Maybe it was something random. But to me, it just feels really close to home. He really probably upset somebody. And the fact that a handkerchief with lipstick was stuffed into his throat really feels like it was personal. I would love to know your guys' theories on this case. It really is living rent-free in my head right now. So pop any theories you have down in the chat. I know a lot of you are internet sleuths, so once you get a case like this, you just deep dive. And I love to hear the feedback. I love to hear what you find. So please let me know in the comments, and I can't wait to see. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. If there's a case you'd like me to cover, pop it in the comments below, and I'll get to as many of them as possible. See you next time.